Здравствуйте, welcome back to Russian Theory Poems and Paintings. Today's day 128, and the lesson today is actually really simple. It's really important, but luckily we've done kind of all the legwork already in terms of adding verbal nouns into the mix here, right? So we're now at the kind of stage three of this coverage of deverbals, right? We started with verbal adverbs, verbal adjectives, of which there were a great variety, of course. And today we have verbal nouns, right? So those are basically nouns formed from verbs, right? So let's see. Let's look at a painting called that involves a verbal noun, kupanie krasного коня, the bathing or the watering or whatever of the red horse, right? So kind of a symbolic painting. I'm not sure what the red horse represents. Maybe Russia, maybe communism. Who knows, right? Okay, so there are lots of famous, by the way, kind of literary passages where there's a horse and a rider, and the horse seems to be the Russian state, the Russian nation, the Russian people, and the question is, where is it being steered? And we'll see possibly, I guess the most famous one in Pushkin's Bronze Horseman later this in this book, right? So anyway, the painting is entitled "Kupanie krasного коня," and kupanie is a verbal noun from the verb kupать, right? Meaning to bathe something, right? To make something bathe, right? Kupаться would mean to bathe yourself, or it could also just kind of mean to go for a swim, right? Like in a river or a lake or something. But here we're doing it to the horse, right? These boys are leading the horses into the river or whatever it is to bathe them, right? Okay, so в этой картине изображены мальчик и красный конь. Okay, compound subject, a boy and a red horse are depicted in the painting. Okay, so by the way, I'm not sure we mentioned this in the last lesson, but we could have a sort of inverted word order, right? The subject could come at the end of a sentence, but that doesn't mean that we can't use a short form adjective, right? We have a subject, we have a linking verb, understood, and depicted, right? A boy and a red horse are depicted, right? That predicate position is going to get the short form adjective if there's one available, and here there is, right? A short form PPP, right? So don't let the word order confuse you too much there. In this painting are depicted a boy and a red horse. Okay, we're saving the subjects there, presumably, because they're kind of the point of the sentence, right? What is in the painting? What's depicted here? Anyway, мальчик купает коня, то есть вводит его в реку. The boy is bathing the horse, that is, he's leading it or steering it into the river. Поэтому картина называется «Купание красного коня». Okay, therefore, the painting is called the bathing of the red horse, right? So купание is our mobile vowel, oh my God, our verbal noun from купать, from the verb купать, right? So купание, we'll see today that all verbal nouns, well, almost all, are special soft neuters, right? So they're going to end in «ие», «купание». Right? Что символизирует конь? What does the horse symbolize? Может быть, эта картина говорит о судьбе России. Maybe the painting is speaking concerning the fate of Russia. Я не знаю, right? I don't know. I don't really presume to know, but we can think about it. Okay, so let's survey these verbal nouns, and this is going to be pretty easy because the verbal nouns can usually be derived straight from the PPPs, right? So you start with a PPP, you can get a verbal noun almost without thinking. So these tend to be pretty easy to form. So let's start with Anya, right? So verbal nouns can end in Anya, and as you may guess, those correspond to PPPs in Anli, right? So let's start with the PPP, pisать, we get pisanly. That suggests a verbal noun, pisание, right? The stress will usually follow straight from the infinitive, right? Pisание, ожидание, желание, собрание, название. Okay, and how are we translating these? Well, we just need a noun that corresponds to right, whatever the verb means, right? So pisать means to write. The verbal noun most generally would refer to the activity of writing, right? It names the activity as a noun, right? And this would correspond, of course, usually to an ing, what's called a gerund in English, right? Right. So writing, I love writing or something, or I love swimming, I love working, whatever. Uh, yeah, of course, I kind of misspoke there. There are other ways to say that. Я люблю работать or whatever. Right, but generally, pisание means the activity of writing. Ожидание means expecting or awaiting, right, that activity. Желание means a wishing, right, the activity of wishing, wanting, desiring. But we'll see with a lot of these that you can often think of a word in English that's not an ing. It doesn't necessarily refer to the activity per se, but rather maybe the result of that activity, sort of the activity understood as a completed whole, sort of. So this can be kind of, it really depends on the word, right? So it's hard to give kind of a rule for this. But for example, ожидание would most usually be translated as expectation. Or желание, we've actually seen a poem with that title, right? Not wishing, but a wish or a desire, right? Just rather more simply. Right? A собрание, that could refer to the activity of collecting, or here's a good example, sort of the result, right? If you are engaged in collecting, then you have a collection, a собрание. Okay, so watch out for that. In the book here, we've suggested some common translations. Some of them may not be entirely predictable. We'll see examples of that later, but just be open to that, right? Try translating them as an ing. That'll usually give you a pretty clear picture of what the basic meaning is, but be open to other meanings that again you just kind of could often guess based on context and based on just the meaning of the given verb. Okay, if the PPP ends in is a t PPP, then we get tie, or in certain cases, especially with certain verb types and whatever, like soft sign verbs, we get soft sign your, which is somewhat unusual, and that's obviously not going to be treated as a special soft noun, at least not usually. We could say more on that in terms of sort of literary forms, but it's not worth getting into. Okay, so from заняты, we would get занятие, занять, right? Занятие, the stress follows the infinitive. Взять, взятие, right? Пить, питье, шить, шитье. Okay, finally, what about ионный and dienный? Well, the good news here is that the verbal nouns are always going to be formed in yenia, right? In the stress, I want to say always, there are probably some exceptions, but it's always on the yeah, pretty much, right? And it's always yeah, not your. Okay, so all that difficulty with yeah versus your, yonly versus yenly that we saw with the PPPs no longer applies with these verbal nouns. Okay, so again, from приготовленный we get приготовление, выраженный corresponds to выражение, решенный, решение. There's another good example, right? That could mean the process of solving, right? Working on solving a problem. And then kind of, you can also name the result, the solution, right? The solution. Введенный gives введение, introducing or introduction. Превращенный gives превращение. Освобожденный gives освобождение, the liberating or simply liberation. Okay, note one special aside, right, is that there are no reflexive verbal nouns in Russian. That doesn't have to be the case, by the way. There are such things in Polish, but in Russian there aren't, right? So if we were working with a verb that happened to have a reflexive particle, the particle just completely drops out of the verbal noun, right? It never appears. Okay, so let's just build a few of these again. Kind of, if we were being extra careful, we would refer back to the PPP, and let's think of possible translations. So from строить, we would get строение, строение, building, right? Not really another obvious translation that leaps to mind there. Let's just go with building. Right, the process of building. Well, construction maybe, right? There's construction going on. That's the construction process. Now there is another noun for that, stroika, but we're going to talk about that kind of thing here in a moment. Okay, anyway, number 2, получить, получение, receiving, right? Or the receipt of documents, receiving, whatever. 3, преувеличить, to exaggerate, преувеличение. Преувеличение could mean exaggerating, right? The activity of exaggerating, or, as you might guess, exaggeration, right? That's an exaggeration. Преувеличение. From гулять, we'd get гуляние, гуляние, right? Strolling, the activity, right? Strolling. 5, исключить, исключение, excluding or exclusion, or here's one that you might not guess, exception, right? An exception. Okay, so there's a good example, right? We mentioned earlier some of these you might not necessarily guess, but there's a very useful term, исключение, right? An exception. Обратиться. Okay, there's a reflexive verb. The particle is not going to appear in the verbal noun, so we're going to get обращение. Remember, that's a Church Slavonic, right? This verb has Church Slavonic mutations. Обращение, an addressing, or simply an address, right? Like a presidential speech to the nation or whatever. Обращение. Number 7, рассказывать, рассказывание, рассказывание, right? Narrating, narration. Number 8, понять, понять, we get понятие, понятие. Understanding, again, maybe less predictable, concept, right? A понятие could be a concept. Okay, number 9, удивить, удивить, удивление, right? Surprising, right? Like the activity of surprising someone, or more commonly, simply surprise, right? Удивление, meaning the feeling, not like I have a surprise for you, that would be surprise, right? Which is obviously a foreign borrowing. But the feeling of surprise is удивление, surprise or amazement. Number 10, снятие, we would get снятие, removal, removing. This also refers, for example, to the lifting of the siege of Leningrad, right? Снятие блокады Leningrada, right? And so again, there's one that might not be quite as predictable, but you see that it means to take from off of, right? So the siege was literally, as it were, taken from off of the city, right? Removed from the city or lifted. 11, объяснить, объяснение, explaining or explanation, explanation. 12, плавать, плавание, swimming, like the activity, right? Плавание, я люблю плавание, я люблю плавать. 13, from кататься, again, we're going to drop the particle, we get катание, right? So фигурное катание is figure skating in Russian. 14, фехтовать, another kind of activity, a sport. Фехтование, fencing, right? That's the activity, the sport, фехтование. 15, быть, we get бытие. Okay, that's a little bit unusual, бытие, in terms of the stress. That means being, right? Existence, being. 16, открыть, открытие, meaning opening, right? Or like the opening of the store, the grand opening. And открывать, that would give открывание, right? Opening as well, but here imperfective. Okay, so let's talk about that a bit. What is the difference between открытие and открывание? And, can we form these verbal nouns from either aspect? The general answer in Slavic, at least in a lot of languages, I mentioned Polish earlier, this would be the case there, you could form verbal nouns from almost any verb, right? Including, like we take a pair like открывать, открыть, you could form imperfective verbal nouns and perfective verbal nouns. And as we might expect, the aspectual distinction would be retained, right? So for example, открывание, the imperfective noun would be refer to the process, right? The opening process. Whereas открытие would refer sort of to the completed action. Okay, but this is quite important. In modern Russian, it almost always works out that the verbal nouns that are used with any kind of regularity are always perfective, right? Now we've seen a couple of exceptions just now, like with activities like sports and things, like from plavit we got plavanie, or katatsu we got katanie, right? So that's one set of obvious exceptions where we're clearly emphasizing the activity itself. That would be imperfective. But again, with so many other verbs, you get the PPP from the not the PPP, the verbal noun from the uh, perfective form of the verb, like открыть, right? So открытие could mean refer to the process or kind of the result, right? The sort of one-time action or event, in this case, the opening of the store. And in cases like that, where you would ever see the imperfective verb, it would often be in a somewhat more technical sense, right? And so, very rare, quite unusual. When you encounter it, it's usually pretty obvious what you're dealing with, right? And the meaning is perfectly clear. One example, maybe kind of a silly one, it sounds like something in a kind of a warning, right? On a warning label or something, that type of language. Будьте осторожны при открывании бутылки шампанского, right? Be careful upon or during the process of opening a bottle of champagne, right? So you see there she's using kind of a technical sense where we really need to emphasize the process, right? While opening, while attempting to open, or something like this. Okay, so watch out for that. But again, if it's not an activity, then you would usually expect the form to come from the perfective. And in that case, it could refer to two things, the process or to the result, right? Or again, the result is sort of the activity understood as a sort of completed whole, like again, the opening of the store or whatever, right? Kind of a one-time event. Okay, so here's a quick survey of, some of these activities, right? These are all imperfective. Купание, плавание, бегание, мышление, рисование, бытие, существование, планирование. Okay, those are all imperfective, so it's not like these things never occur. But again, take the example, the pair объяснять, объяснить. Okay, could you form an imperfective объясняние to mean very clearly the process of explaining? In theory, I guess there's nothing stopping you, but I've never heard that, right? It's just, you just never hear it. I should maybe Google it and see if it ever crops up. But again, basically, the reason is you would use the perfective, объяснение, which could mean the process of explaining, or more usually simply the explanation, right? Объяснение, the explanation. So a few examples of this: убеждение, освобождение, разочарование, удовлетворение, закрытие, объятие, right? And you see the most typical translations would be sort of the kind of perfective understanding of kind of the result, or освобождение, the liberation, not attempting to liberate, but just the liberation. Now, of course, освобождение could also refer to the process, right? Like the attempt to free Leningrad from the siege, or finally the end result, the liberation of Leningrad. Разочарование, that refers to the feeling, right? The sense of disappointment, the sense of satisfaction. Удовлетворение, закрытие, the closing, the closure. And finally, объятие means basically a hug, right? Embracing, or an embrace, a hug. Okay, so one final note today, and this is important, and this is kind of, we're looking down the road. We're not going to cover this today. But, in theory, we could form a verbal noun from any verb pretty much whatsoever. We've seen today that in practice, a lot of imperfectives wouldn't normally be used, right? But beyond that, certain verbs, the noun that sort of goes with them, right? Just the basic noun that's associated with the verb is not the verbal noun, meaning it's not a noun that's derived from the verb. Rather, it's a noun that's built off the root that was used to create the verb in the first place. So instead of deriving something that's sort of more artificial or more derivative than the verb itself, we're reaching back, as it were, to a more basic form that was also used to create the verb, basically. Okay, so we're going to cover this a lot later in book 4, but for now I'll just give one example. Let's take the verb встречать, встретить, right? So you might expect some form like Встречание. Okay, that's totally weird because it's from the imperfective. Okay, so let's discard that. Well, is there a form from встретить? Like you might guess встречение or встретение or something, right? Basically, no, right? In normal Russian, the verb, the noun that would go with this verb встретить would be встреча, which basically means a meeting, an encounter, right? The we're naming the activity встретить, to meet, to encounter, to run into. That's встреча. Okay, so that встреча, we've got a feminine noun that is basically built directly off of the встреть root that we see was used to make the verb встретить in the first place, right? There's a little mutation involved, right? Встреть, встреча, right? We've got the ch instead of the t. But we can see basically what's going on. We've got the встреть, the root that was used to make both the verb встретить, встречать, встретить, and here is being used in a very basic, very simple noun, встреча. Okay, so file that away, and I guess for now, just keep in mind that you won't see all verbal nouns that you could potentially imagine existing in the language don't necessarily exist, or at any rate, they're not normally used with any frequency, right? So we will revisit that topic later in book 4. Until next time, до свидания, товарищи.